21st, we're going to hear a singer-songwriter, Chip Albright, perform songs from his album, 25, and poet David Wolf is going to read from his book, 7, and they play together. And it's always a fun evening. That starts at 6:30. Then Wednesday, the 22nd, Ellen Cutler will share her book, and the title is From the Depths, Dyslexia, Bipolar Disorder, and the Triumph of Art. It's a biography of the artist Gary Horn and an exploration of his painting. So we're doing all kinds of cultural things next week. All right, and you can find details on our website, or we do have a list of all of our upcoming events too. Now, on to tonight's program. In the first decades of the 20th century, Saloon proprietor Erastus Wallace Scott of Des Moines, with his cousins in the infamous Carter Gang, operated a campaign of murder, fraud, corruption, and prostitution from his bar on East Corridor. A subsequent murder brought cousin Will to the forefront. A land fraud scheme involving all three Carter brothers followed, including grand theft and even more deaths. Authors David and Rose Donovan recount the long-forgotten story of a crime family's nefarious reach beyond the red light district. David is a retired lawyer and amateur genealogist. He practiced law most of his career for an international firm based in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and he spent half a decade as general counsel for the Washington, D.C. NFL franchise. Rose Donovan is a retired journalist, having worked for decades as a reporter and editor for suburban newspapers in the D.C. area, and later the Washington Post. They have 3 children and 2 grandchildren, and they now live in a small town on the eastern shore of Maryland, not far from where Rose's ancestors landed in America in the 1650s, and where David serves as a town commissioner. This is their first book. And before I turn it over, we're going to have Doug Burns here as moderator, and he's still on the way, but he popped a tire. And he called me from Ogden. And so they're going to talk a little bit about their book, and then when Doug gets here, he'll join and have more of a conversation.
Yeah.
Okay, let's hear it for David and Rose.
This is wonderful. Thank you all for coming. Before we get started, just to get a sense of how much you know about the book, how many of you heard the River to River interview earlier this week? Just a few. And any the podcast, or so most of you just kind of word of mouth learned about it. Oh, great! So you can kind of start from scratch.
And there's family and friends here, but also strangers. So that's a little scary. But we've been having very friendly audiences full of my Des Moines family and Iowa City, my Iowa City family. So it's been really incredibly fun. So I'll start with sort of our elevator pitch, which is that we didn't ever intend to write a book. We were really wanting more information about my great-grandfather, who was rumored to have had scandalous death in the early 1900s. And that had been a family rumor, and at some point we learned a little bit more about that, but my husband, the amateur genealogist, just wanted to find out more about it, and I guess that my family tree is more interesting than his, so
as it turns out.
So he'd been spending time whenever he could over the years doing genealogy research, and then he retired right before COVID happened, and so retirement and COVID gave him a little more time. And then we built a house on the eastern shore of Maryland, so that took up a lot of time. And once we got settled, then he really, it was about 3 years ago, he really started in seriously to find the story. And it just, everything he found got crazier and crazier and bigger and bigger. And what we learned about my great-grandfather's death, his scandalous death, you'll have to read the book to find out what happened to him. But it was newspaper stories, newspaper archives, that really gave us this story because my family knew nothing about it. The family didn't talk about this. My grandmother didn't tell anybody what a bad man her father was. And so we learned more and more about the crimes that he was involved in. He owned a saloon and operated a saloon, the Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, down on East Court Avenue, right over the Court Avenue Bridge. It's right across the street from where I think it's the police headquarters is now. And the stories that we found about him really started right about 1900. And he died in 1912. So there were a dozen years of crazy stories. And every story led us to more people. We found out that he had a group of cousins, three in particular, who were the Carter brothers, and together with my great-grandfather, Erastus Wallace Scott, they were the Carter gang, terrorizing Des Moines and central Iowa for, a decade or so.
And basically, the inroad, as Rose said, was learning about her great-grandfather's death. And when we found those newspaper articles, immediately after he died, former associates of his who were in the penitentiary said, yeah, you remember that murder back in 1905? He told me he did it. So that got me searching for the murder in 1905, and I found those newspaper stories, the first of which had a reference, kind of buried in the text, that the guy who was accused of the crime, his name was W.L. Carter, was a cousin and close associate of Erastus Wallace Scott, who recently committed a murder for which he was never prosecuted. And I thought, well, what are we on to here? There was an accusation of a murder, and then there was a trial for murder, but he wasn't the guy tried, and then there was an accusation of a murder that took place in his bar 18 months before the murder that got us started. So the through line of the book is this murder in 1905 of a farmer named Edward Gresser. And we cover the theory of the prosecution in the case was purely circumstantial, and it was that W.L. Carter and unnamed others had forged a deed, forged sales documents, and then in order to get his property, they wanted his land, his farm. And then in order to cover up the fraud, well, Gresser needed to be dead, because otherwise he would say he didn't sign those documents. So Gresser was murdered. That was the government's theory. So the book starts with the murder. In the middle of the book, we get to Erastus's death and the accusations against him for having committed the murder. And then the book ends with the manhunt described by the Register in a particularly breathless phrase as the biggest manhunt in the world, which clearly wasn't. But it might have been the biggest manhunt in a six-state area to find the last surviving member of the Carter gang, who had been associated in the press with the murder back in 1905, had been involved with the gang in all of their fraud escapades between 1906 and 1916 or 1917, and then was the last man who either wasn't in jail or dead in 1918 when the police went after him. And so that's kind of the beginning, the middle, and the end of the book. And in between,
the murder is never
solved. Nobody was ever convicted. There was one indictment, two indictments, one trial, a lot of accusations, but no one was ever found guilty for having pulled the trigger of the gun that killed Edward Gresser. In between the beginning and the end, we have a fascinating land fraud that the same group of people was involved in around 1907, in which they schemed to persuade a physician in Des Moines who needed to move to Kirksville, Missouri. They persuaded him to swap his lovely home in Des Moines for an even nicer home in Kirksville, Missouri, which, unbeknownst to this poor doctor, these guys didn't know. I can't begin to describe all the details of the fraud, but I told a group the other day, you guys all remember Mission Impossible, right? In the 60s. Mm-hmm. Remember how they always put a mask on and pass themselves off as somebody else to fool whoever they were after into believing he was in a different place or a different situation? This was very much like that. This is long before the days of photo IDs. So there was 4 or 5 people involved in the fraud, each of whom played at least 2 different roles, some played 3 different roles of different characters in the fraud. One would pretend to be the agent for the seller that didn't exist. One pretended to be the seller who didn't really exist. One pretended to be the buyer when they went to the land office to exchange the deeds. But you've got to read this section. That's the only place you might slow you down a little bit because it's a very complicated fraud. And then there's the whole trial of that fraud as well, which brought in the former chief of detectives of Des Moines, who was part of the gang at that point. And then once we get into the 19-teens, we have the massive larceny project they went on. They had warehouse robberies and farm robberies, and they collected all they did this really from 1906 until the last of them was caught in 1917 for one of the biggest fencing operations in the history of the Midwest up to that point. At one point, I believe the paper said they had what would today be $2.5 million worth of merchandise, bales of hay, car engines, tires, women's nightwear. I mean, anything that didn't get nailed down, these guys sold. And they were, and that's kind of near the end of the book when we finally get into the manhunt. But that's kind of, and then there's some other tales in there too. In addition to this, that was the thing that we found the most amazing. Again, we never set out to write a book, but we discovered the one murder, and then the trial, and then another murder, and then another fraud, and then all the grand larceny, and then the manhunt. And we said, this is more than just a family story.
Yeah, that's right. And
we didn't even talk about the prostitution.
Oh yeah, we will talk about the prostitution, I promise. Yeah, along the way, it stopped being a story of forgotten family history, and it really morphed into a story of long forgotten Des Moines history, a story that I didn't know existed, and I grew up here. And it just seemed like it was a story that needed to be told. You know, especially because it was Des Moines, Iowa. I mean, you all know this is, synonymous with Iowa nice and family values and, the breadbasket of the country. And so the very idea that this seedy underbelly existed, and that this neighborhood, and we get into the neighborhood where the Saloon was, just down the street from the gleaming gold-domed Capitol building. And so the Saloon became, the characters were characters in the story. The Saloon was kind of larger than life as well, and the Saloon became a character. And as a review that we just saw a couple days ago said, the city itself really is the main character in this book. And we're a couple of journalists who we started off as journalists together, met in journalism school at Iowa State. And so for us to put this whole story together using newspaper archives, because there weren't family memories, there were no diaries, we didn't have anything to go on, but the research that we, and by we I mean he, did. And the newspapers themselves became a character in the story, because when you read the book, this was the height of yellow journalism, sort of the heyday of yellow journalism, and newspapers were written very differently than they are today, and they were so entertaining. We have so many of the stories that we've reproduced in the book. The language is not language that gets used today. It's very florid and descriptive.
And these folks were in the papers. I don't want to say every day, but certainly there are periods of time where they're in all 3 of the town's daily newspapers almost every day. Sometimes front page stories.
Front page news.
And just on the last point, Rose, that I just was reminded of this one sentence in the introduction. So during the years of the events in this book, Des Moines appears to have more resembled a lawless frontier town plagued by corruption, murder, alcohol, and syphilis than the mild-mannered, rapidly growing state capital is remembered as today. And when you read this book, I mean, the police corruption, the theft, East Court Avenue as the epicenter of just lawless murder, people just being shot on the street, prostitution. rampant. In fact, there's a story, there's a reference in the book. At one point, the city fathers decided they were going to try and corral all the prostitution into one place, so at least they could keep an eye on it, which really meant they could levy the fines more easily. And there was going to be East Court Avenue between the bridge and about 4th Street. And when they floated this idea, the prostitutes and their landlords said, that's never going to work. We're not moving there. It's too crazy. So,
That's right. But the city, I think, is hoping that if when the houses of ill fame or resorts, sometimes they call them, that when resorts came in, they might spruce the neighborhood up a little bit. They were hoping that the prostitution would provide some sort of urban renewal to the neighborhood. I don't think that's what happened. Do you want to read while we wait for Doug?
sure. You read the Gresser murder?
Yeah, read the rest of it.
That's probably a good place to start. This is, and again, everything in this book is taken from a contemporaneous source. For the most part, it's newspaper articles. And we found almost 600 newspaper articles about these guys, her great-grandfather and his cousins, and then another couple of hundred articles about some of the other people in the gang, some of the other events, and the chapter on Count
You must have
Nefarious.
done a lot of head scratching.
Oh, well, I'll just say a word about the research. It's at least it's available online. If you had to go back to microfiche, like you had to do in the day, this would have been impossible to research, because you literally would have had to look at every page of every newspaper for 20 years. Impossible. But the tools we have are way better than that, but they're still pretty weak. When you're searching for a story about Erastus Wallace Scott, you can search for Erastus, not a terribly uncommon name at the time. You can search for Wallace, could be a first name, could be a last name. Sometimes he went by Walter, and then or Scott. Well, Scott could be a first name, it could be a street name, it's the name of a bridge. And every time, if you just put in Scott, you got every single article in every paper in which the word Scott appears. And so, you go through periods where I wouldn't find anything for days that's relevant to anything. But
He's way more patient than I am.
that's the nicest word you've used for that.
Usually it's compulsive.
Yeah, compulsive.
With another word in front of it.
Yeah, that's right. So let me read to you about the murder of Edward Gresser, which is, as I say, this is the chapter 1. On the evening of Monday, October 2nd, 1905, Edward Gresser stood in the orange glow of his kitchen lamp, filling his pipe. He had been out most of the day, but before he left his home that morning, he had tacked a note on his door for his neighbor, Will Carter, whom he had expected to come by to discuss the sale of his farm. Gresser, a 34-year-old bachelor, had bought his 70-acre farm in Avon, just southeast of Des Moines, 2 years earlier from a family who had been farming there since the 1850s. Gresser was born in Illinois, but his neighbors in Avon thought of him as German. No doubt he picked up an accent from his parents and two of his older siblings, who immigrated to Illinois from Germany a few years before Edward was born. In the couple of years after he bought the farm, Gresser became friendly with his neighbors in Avon, including Carter, better known by his initials W.L., who had owned one of the neighboring farms since the 1880s. Although still nominally a farmer, W.L. ran a local business as a bail bondsman, and he and his mother Sarah were active real estate investors. As he stood in his kitchen that October evening, he did not notice that a horse-drawn buggy had pulled up in front of his farmhouse. Gresser was faintly lit by a kerosene lamp burning on his kitchen table, where he had been reading a newspaper. He stood and walked to a window, where he pulled out a match to light his pipe, when a bullet crashed through the window, struck him in the head and killed him. He collapsed to the floor in a pool of blood, a, quote, ghastly bullet hole in his temple. Gresser's body lay on his kitchen floor for days until it was discovered by a neighbor. His hat, bearing the bullet hole and pipe, lay on the floor beside him. The coroner determined that the bullet had struck him in the side of the head above the temple and exited from the side of his neck. The downward course the bullet had taken made it almost certain that the shot had been fired from someone either seated in a buggy or perhaps lying in wait in the branches of an apple tree outside the window. 2 days after Gresser's murder, but before the neighbor's discovery of the body the following Friday, W.L. Carter left his office in downtown Des Moines to file a deed with the Polk County Recorder's Office. That deed, bearing the signature of, quote, E.J. Gresser, reflected Gresser's sale of his farm to Carter for $1,700. The deed was dated September 25th, 1905, a week before Gresser's murder.
And Doug has arrived.
Doug. Thanks for making it.
I am another victim of climate change. My tire blew on the way from Carroll.
Yeah.
So it was so hot, it just exploded. And I can change it fast, but not fast enough to see my friend from down the street. So anyway, I apologize. I do this quite often. I've been here well in advance, but can't predict the tire exploding.
We've just given kind of an introduction, kind of a very high-level overview of the book,
Okay.
the Gresser murder, and some of the research and tools we used to find out about it.
Well, wonderful.
And Doug, you're going to have to talk loud because
Everybody can hear me, right? I'm usually pretty good at projecting.
Yep.
You guys all good in the back too?
Okay.
You good? Okay. So, Dave, Rose, tell us, first of all, who was Erastus Wallace Scott? Have you really described who he was?
Not really much about who he was, a little bit about what he did, but not really who he was.
Maybe your connection to him, Rose, and how you got interested in him, because he's kind of the linchpin or the central figure in this book.
Yeah, my long-lost great-grandfather on my dad's side, who died before my dad was born, he would have been my dad's grandfather, and knew absolutely nothing about him. But it turns out he was the notorious bad man of Des Moines. And that, when we saw that in the newspaper, that caught our attention. Like, what was so bad about this guy? Well, he was really, really bad. We've said that he owned the Nastiest Saloon in Iowa, and he was violent. He was, especially I think when he was drinking. We've talked about 2 murders, and we'll get to the previous one, the one that we discovered later. But he was very violent. There were lots of assaults, and 2 wives. My great-grandmother, who he left when very early 1900s, and he had three daughters, and I don't know that he ever saw them again, although they were living a few blocks away, and my great-grandmother was calling herself a widow, but he was right there, criming all over the place. So a really, really bad guy.
He was referred to in the newspapers over the years as someone who was willing to beat someone to death over the drop of a hat, and he tried several times. He was charged with attempted murder in 1901. He was charged with attempted murder, initially charged with attempted murder of the second wife in 1908, with serious assaults with serious weapon, like bars of steel. And he was just a very, very violent man.
And I think, like Doug is getting at, nobody in the family knew anything about him. So why was this such a secret? And why was this all buried so deeply that nobody knew anything about it? Which was what was intriguing, especially to a couple of journalists.
Right. So both I'm sure there was an introduction already, but both Rose and Dave, very accomplished journalists.
Well, she's the accomplished journalist. I was trained.
You were the editor of the newspaper in Sarasota, Florida.
I was an editor a little after me, Dan.
Everybody here has heard of Sarasota, Florida, right?
Yeah.
You were editor of a newspaper in town everybody's heard of.
Okay.
So, that's not nothing.
And I was a reporter at the same time.
Yes.
My stories got great play.
Your stuff was always above the fold.
Yeah, that's great. So, as writers, you know that sense of place is really important in writing at all levels. So tell us give us like scene set. Where and when did this reporting take place? It's East Court Avenue in an area where there's a courts building now. Maybe you can describe the time and the place that's the primary setting for this book. Because the book rivers out into different areas of Des Moines and history, but it's really centered on this one sort of infamous and kind of forgotten pocket. Explain where it is and how it existed, and describe it in the early 1900s.
Well, I attempted to find out when the building was built and exactly who had occupied it over the years. It was a billiards hall on the Sanborn fire maps in the 1890s. Scott appears to have taken it over. I'm not 100% sure he owned it. He was certainly described as having been its owner starting in around 1901. He and the family had been farming for a number of years in the 1880s and early 1890s.
I think he was a failed farmer.
He was definitely a failed farmer, and moved into town, where they moved to a different location every year for a while, and he took on a series of laborer jobs. But by about 1901, 1902, he was operating the saloon. We're not sure what its name was. We've never seen an actual reference to it. There are only 2 known photographs of the building itself. Both are terrible images. You can imagine the photographic reproduction back then was dreadful. And in the later of the photographs, this is about 2 years after he sold it, or at least got rid of it, there's a big round sign, and the only thing you can read in that sign is it says beer. And that's the saloon. Now, it was, ironically, from the pictures I've seen, probably the nicest building on the street. It was a brick building. It had on 2 sides. It was on First Avenue and Court. It had nice brickwork, a big awning that came down over the front. It was pretty good size. We know that on one occasion, that maybe we'll get to talk about at some point, it held more than 100 people for a meeting. Upstairs were 5 or 6 rooms, which it appears from almost the get-go were used for brothels, for the prostitutes that either he rented rooms to or perhaps somehow even operated. The rest of the street, I think we say in the book, to describe it as ramshackle is generous.
A slum.
Literally, they are wooden slums, and there's a couple photographs from the Register, and you look at it and you go, that's somebody's shed on a farm. No. That is one of the buildings on East Court Avenue between 1st and 2nd. And there's the only building taller than a story was his saloon. And there are wood buildings that, in a good wind, you think would probably just blow away. And they're all gone now. Everything on that street is gone. They tore them down, according to the National Registry of Historic Places, referencing the police headquarters that's on right directly across the street today from where the saloon was. It says in there that building was built to finally eliminate the vice on East Court Avenue, and then that's when they tore everything down.
So in the book, you reference 2 areas that are either adjacent or in reading the book, I got the sense that they weren't quite there, but like San Francisco has an area called the Tenderloin, which is notorious. You've heard of that. Notorious for crime. There's an area in Des Moines called the Tenderloin, and then the area in London which was heavily known for prostitution, and this area was a hunting ground for Jack the Ripper, Whitechapel. There were areas known as the Tenderloin and Whitechapel in Des Moines. I found that to be a fascinating part of the book. So maybe you can explain where the Tenderloin gets its name. I think a lot of people probably know.
Yeah, I do.
And then where these areas were in Des Moines, and did they kind of still exist, or are they just totally gone?
They're all gone.
I don't think so. Yeah, I had to look up the Tenderloin, and if I remember correctly, I think it might have come from England or San Francisco. I don't remember exactly, but the idea being that these were very dangerous neighborhoods and full of prostitution and crime, and the police were on the take, and to look the other way. And so they were the only ones that they got paid off to look the other way, and so the police were the only ones who could afford a nice cut of meat for dinner, and that became the Tenderloin district. And the Whitechapel, Dave might remember.
Whitechapel's on the west side of the river. In the 1890s, it was not far from off of East Court, but south.
It's like
South Taylor. The White Line Transfer building is, and I think it's become condominiums.
That's right, it's condominiums now. And it was pretty much cleaned up. I think the railroad moved in there and moved out all the houses of prostitution because they just didn't want them in the neighborhood.
Yeah,
So
and
the
I think-
Whitechapel wasn't much in existence anymore after
No, in fact,
1900.
I think that's how Court Avenue came to be, because they were trying to clean up that, and maybe, I think it was because the railroad came in, they were trying to clean up that Whitechapel district, and so they moved, like we said a little earlier, they moved all the prostitutes across the river to East Court Avenue.
While we're focused on the prostitution issue, in this book you really report about what I would call an industrial scale level of prostitution. It's really staggering. In 1908, the Register reported that so-called social diseases were responsible for about 80% of the deaths of women in Des Moines, and about 75% of the men of a certain age in Des Moines, I think by the time they were 30 or 40, had contracted some kind of an STD. And again, this is the Des Moines Register reporting this in 1908. How, like, could you give us a sense? Like the book does. The book reports it in great detail. Just again, the industrial scale nature of this. So this just wasn't like a one-off, tiny little pocket, a couple of wayward people. I mean, this was an industry. Maybe explain how rampant it was.
Yeah, and I think you should read from the Register's editorial too.
Yeah.
We can set it up, but
There's two aspects of this that are important to note. One, the city was getting so much revenue from the fines imposed on the prostitutes that the mayor was quoted in the paper as saying, why aren't you ending this? He said, we got to do something to keep the city running. They needed the money from the fines to keep the city running. And then at various times, the brothels were spread more broadly, and the buildings in which the women rented rooms were owned by the most prominent people in town, including
we talk about eating Hubbles and Yonkers, and I don't.
they're the ones whose
they're the
names
main
everybody
ones,
knows.
and they knew what their properties were being used for, and Hubble was confronted about it, and basically said, "Yeah, go away. I don't have time to talk about this." And the best tenants are the tenants that can pay me the rent.
Well, and when you consider just how dilapidated and run down these buildings were that were being rented out, and this is commented about in the newspaper, so there's no way anybody would rent these rooms out for $35 a week, which was a great deal of money back then. These are just shacks, little shacks, renting out for $35, $45 a week. And one of Hubble's property managers said he kept a separate ledger of all the properties rented out to prostitutes. And he said Mr. Hubble knew exactly what they were. And his view was, I can't get that kind of money from anybody else, we'll rent them out to prostitutes. So that's a picture of just how common it was, and you mix that with the statistics, and you can't be sure that the registered statistics were 100% accurate, but they're pretty grim. If things were half as bad as they said they were, it was pretty grim.
Even a fourth.
Yeah, right. It was just terrible.
And the way you unearth these names that are still prominent is when the city elected to finally, I think that there was they gave somebody, there was a detective Harden who was sort of corrupt, and when he was kind of cleared out, there was somebody that came in that was kind of an Elliot Ness type, clean it all up guy. So indictments started to flow, and when those indictments flowed, then that's where you saw some of the names.
The
right?
very first indictment in the city's effort to shut down prostitution was the indictment of Erastus Wallace Scott, whose saloon was known to be kind of the hotbed for where everybody went when they wanted to visit a prostitute. That indictment was announced to great fanfare in the newspaper, and supposedly this was just the vanguard of an effort to really crack down. This is, I think, in 1905. And then it just kind of went away. Now, we don't know exactly why it just kind of went away. There was a lot of corruption, and these people were really tight with the investigators and the police in the right places that prevented indictments. But after a couple years, I think principally after that editorial came out in the Register, the city fathers finally said, well, this is killing us. Literally, we need to do something about it. And they had a gentleman named Hammery was his last name, and they basically finally just turned to him and said, you have the authority to do whatever you need to do, clean this up. And he literally shut down East Court Avenue in 1908 or 1909. We've got the articles, and it's actually a fascinating read. when you see because the description of what East Court Avenue was like every day, 20 hours a day, to what it became the night they shut it down is really quite something. Because they did shut it down.
And in the Register's reporting, Kate, Rose, the prostitutes were described as inmates because there was a punitive system of rents and a way that what you write about, what you call the Scarlet Trust, which is this collection, this cabal of business people and others that are either directly involved or adjacent to it. They kept women in situations where it's not like they could just, there were these two girls that were lured into it from Lamoni that were smart enough to be able to get to a train station, I think in Valley Junction, and be able to get back to Lamoni. And so they escaped it, but others were like they were trapped. They didn't even have clothes to put on to leave their homes or leave these like houses of ill fame, and then they were called inmates. Could you really describe that? There wasn't like an element of like choice, like this isn't Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, where Richard Gere is going to just come in and like take her away. Like the way these women went out was either through suicide or through contracting an STD and being taken out by the court.
Yeah, that's right.
That's true.
That's right. This was sex trafficking that was happening. They were luring young women, young girls from all over the state to come into the city to work at jobs that didn't really exist. And we talked about the two sisters from Lamoni who came to Des Moines thinking that they had a restaurant job. And there was a sandwich wagon there, but there was no restaurant job. And they were in this house or apartment, and
just 3 doors down from Erastus.
Right, very close to the saloon. And men kept coming in, and finally the woman who ran it said, "Don't you want to go in the back room and entertain some of these men that have come in?" And these girls figured out what was going on, and they said, we have to go out and run an errand. We'll be back. And instead they hooked it to Valley Junction. And that had been bothering me, like, how did they get from East Court Avenue to Valley Junction? So yesterday I Googled it, and there was a streetcar system, and it told me where they would have picked up the streetcar and where they had to transfer to the line that took them out to the railroad station at Valley Junction. So I found that interesting.
If I could just read just a couple paragraphs from the book, quoting mostly this full-page editorial in the Register under the headline, "The Scarlet Monster's Blight." And the photograph featured in the book, on this editorial, that's Scott's bar right there. And it's even discussed in the editorial. And this is in 1908, just a year and a half or so after he was out of the bar business because he was at Fort Madison in jail. Outrage was growing against the awful sacrifice exacted on Des Moines by the Scarlet Monster, a venereal disease, particularly syphilis. A lengthy full-page editorial in the Register in March 1908 could hardly have been more blistering in its assessment of the health toll from the brothels or its condemnation of the city's failure to act. And now I'm quoting, and you just pay attention to the language they use. "Lurking in the shadows, shunning the day and thriving in the blackest night, a great ugly scarlet monster is fastening its blight upon this fair city, silently, mysteriously. There is wretchedness in its presence, contagion in its breath, and disease and death in its foul touch. And unhampered, it creeps and crawls stealthily everywhere, a long, slimy, slippery trail, claiming its victims by the thousands." And then they recite some of the statistics that Doug referenced a minute ago, and they say the monster was, quote, "creating more suffering and adding more to the sum of misery of men, women, and children than any other one factor of evil that besieges humankind. And yet, quote, Des Moines does worse than nothing. In fact, Des Moines encourages it by extracting license money from the unfortunates who spread their loathsome disease." And then there's one other paragraph I want to read describing the photograph. "One principal street, which begins at the east end of the Court Avenue Bridge for several blocks, is given up almost entirely to houses of prostitution. At one end stands a notorious saloon, the scene of many crimes, even murders, and for years a harbor for criminals and a plotting place for the evil-minded. From this place on, there is one wretched shack after another, most of them even more wretched than the wretched inmates who stand in the doors or look from the windows with bleared eyes and pained faces, puffing cigarettes, leering with sickening smiles at passers-by, cursing each other or indulging in vile jokes. And although barely legible in the photograph, the two-story building on the corner with the sign reading beer is almost certainly the site of Scott's former bar.
So did they have them drugged also?
I didn't see anything where that accusation was made. It was more just they were charged so much money. They would be charged for the nightgowns that they wore, or the negligees, the outfits, and at an exorbitant rate. They were charged an exorbitant rate for rent. Food was brought into them. They didn't have clothes to wear to go out and buy food, so food was brought into them at exorbitant rates. And what the papers refer to as the Scarlet Trust were the companies selling the clothes, selling the jewelry they made them wear, selling the food so that they could at least stay alive, and renting the apartments to them. And when the public rose up in the initial stages of this demand to end all this, the Scarlet Trust, this is a real thing. These people really exist, these businesses and individuals. They got together and said, okay, everybody calm down. We'll just all agree amongst ourselves to charge less rent. And honestly, and people said, that's not going to do it. And that led to Mr. Hammery, as I described a minute ago, which led to finally ending all this.
I mean, ultimately, the political force to really create this change, it came from politically active women, didn't it, Rose? I mean, it was the Women's Christian Temperance Union. It was some of these groups that saw what the male leaders of the community were looking the other way at, or worse, complicit in, and then they put the pressure on to ultimately create this change. So really, it was quite literally women saving women, wasn't it?
I think that's true. I do. And we do talk about the Christian temperance movement coming to town to try to save all the souls that were in these saloons. And they came directly to Scott's Saloon and had a revival meeting. And they were very well known.
Internationally well known.
Yeah, internationally well known. They were the Saloon preachers, and they'd been in Chicago. I think they'd been in Milwaukee. They'd been in Europe, so it was groups like that really tried very hard to clean things up, to clean up the alcohol problem that was very closely related to the prostitution problem.
And the violence that was visited upon women by Erastus, Wallace, Scott, who went by Wallace, probably, as you said, should have continued to go by Erastus, but I mean, it was your great grandmother Mary.
Oh, that's right. So we talked about 1908 when the Moines Register Scarlet Monster full-page editorial was published. Right about that time is when my great-grandmother, Erastus's first wife, died of, we believe, syphilis in the State Mental Hospital at Clarinda. And so a very personal to me victim of the prostitution and the venereal disease problem in Des Moines.
She was basically losing her mind in the last few years of her life. She could no longer work. Her daughters were working since they were 13 and 12 just to support their mother because the Erastus had abandoned them. And in end of 1907, I believe, Mary and her daughter and Mary's brother took her by train, presumably from Des Moines to Clarinda, and had her committed. And she died 4 months after that.
How do you think this, I mean, did this generate any generational trauma that you think is still maybe it affected other generations of your family and maybe even yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent question, and that was what was driving me, I think. I don't think that was what was driving Dave. He just loved the thrill of the chase here. But I wondered so much how all this affected Well, my great-grandmother, who comes to a very sad end, she was in her 40s when she died, and my grandmother, who was a teenager when her father left the family, and as we know, was a very violent man. So I am just certain that she and her sisters had to have suffered tremendously, and they're never spoken of again in the newspapers. He, as we learn, he takes on a second wife, a much younger girl, about the same age as my grandmother was at the time, a young woman named Lulu, and I don't know if we want to read her the wedding announcement that was in the newspaper, but really, the driving force for me was how this all affected my grandmother, her 6 children, their offspring, and you see bits and pieces of it in the following generations, and I did want to do a more personal story about generational trauma, but I really didn't have the source material. The family was all gone, and there was nobody left to ask. I had heard rumors that my grandmother would take to her bed for weeks, days and weeks at a time when she was raising her 6 children, suffered from some unknown malady, and I never knew what that was, and she died when I was in high school. She was in her 80s, and so she lived a good long life. So I now really believe that she suffered from PTSD, anxiety disorder, all of it from her childhood.
So when we, Dave and I are both from Carroll, which is known, Carroll County, for Templeton Rye. So we've always sort of there's a romanticism to that era, that Prohibition era that at least I've actually written about it and probably elevated that. But in reading this, and when you were writing it, I've always thought of Prohibition as misguided and puritanical and foolish, but when you read how pervasive alcohol was in the community and how it led to these deaths and just so many crimes, should we look at Prohibition as almost a necessary reset? I've never looked at it as anything but idiotic. But in reading this book, I'm starting to say, well, God, if I were alive then, I might have sided with the Women's Christian Temperance Union, who I thought were fools my whole life.
Well, there actually was no discussion in this time period of prohibition that I found.
But this was before, yeah.
There's no hint of anybody saying we shouldn't allow liquor to exist. And in fact, these saloon preachers that Rose was talking about a minute ago, the reason that they were welcomed into these saloons was because they didn't talk about prohibition. They weren't trying to persuade anybody not to drink. Their pitch was, we're going in to find the places where the lowest of the low are living to teach them about Jesus Christ and save their souls. And if there's a little less drinking going on as a consequence, the saloon keepers seem to be okay with that. If anything, perhaps to keep the grand juries away and to keep getting shut down.
Right, and it was, and that temperance revival meeting in Scott's Saloon was big news at the time, and there's just a marvelous story that was written about it in the newspaper, and we quote that, and you'll see what happens. Erastus sees the light very briefly.
At least until the next day.
But that was just wonderful reading. It was one of the, reading the newspaper stories of the time really was one of the most fun things about this project.
Well, and we've talked to other groups. We kept on having these "you'll never believe this" moments doing the research, and this story about the revival meeting in his bar was one of those. And when you're doing research the way we had to do it, it's just by looking for words. Okay, here's a story about Scott. Oh, Scott's Saloon. Oh, what's this about? And I saw the story and read the article that Rose refers to. I printed it out and brought it up to you. You're never going to believe this. It just was one after, and finding out about Lulu, his second wife. And
the one to go back to the bar though. The one picture that we have of Erastus is from that story, or I think maybe the
Yes.
follow-up story the next day when
Yeah.
when he was back at the bar slinging drinks, and it's one of the only pictures that was really reproducible, and he's
Under the headline, becomes converted, quits the saloon. He's just in a nice three-piece suit, leaning back up against
Yeah.
the
It
bar.
was for like maybe 12 hours.
That's right. But what was so striking was Dave brings this photo out to me of Erastus leaning back against the bar, and it was shocking. He looks exactly like my dad, who was his grandson. It was uncanny.
When I saw the picture, my jaw dropped and I said, Rose, who's this look like? Actually, I do have a little section that we've read to other groups about the first murder he committed. It's just a couple paragraphs.
Is that more shade?
That's Morris Shea, who he had killed about 18 months before E.J. Gresser was murdered. Oh, and we didn't mention it. E.J. Gresser, according to the stories immediately after Gresser's death, once they pointed the finger at W.L. Carter, they alleged in the papers that the murder was hatched, planned, discussed in Scott's saloon. So Scott's name came up in connection with the murder, although he was never accused of anything. He was just referenced Scott's saloon. Scott's the guy that 18 months ago murdered this other guy and seems to have gotten away with it. So this is that story. At around 9:30 p.m. on March 2nd, 1904, Morris Shea and James Crippen entered Scott's saloon, where Scott and another man were tending bar. Although neither Shea nor Crippen were, quote, real staggering drunk when they entered, they, quote, were on a high road to such a condition, and both were quarrelsome, as was their custom when in liquor. Several other patrons, including one woman, witnessed the scene. Almost at once, Shea and Crippen launched into a, quote, tongue attack on Scott, to which Scott responded by asking them to, quote, have a little consideration for that lady. One of the two responded, to hell with you and the lady, and Scott claimed he saw Crippen pass Shea his gun. Scott told a reporter that he immediately pulled a .38 caliber revolver that he kept in a cash drawer, and, quote, you know the result. Scott fired 3 shots, 2 hit Shea, one in the shoulder, another in the chest. Shea, helped by Crippen, staggered out of the saloon and headed east on Court Avenue for about 20 feet, where he dropped dead with a bullet through the heart. After Shea fell dead on the sidewalk outside the saloon, quote, Scott went on serving drinks, and neither the bar's patrons nor others nearby paid much attention to the commotion until a bystander, stumbled over Shea's dead body in the street and, quote, spread the alarm. Crippen later denied that Shea had a gun, and no gun other than Scott's was ever found. Des Moines Chief of Detectives Eli Hardin was present on the scene immediately after Shea's shooting. Scott was jailed that night and arraigned days later on a charge of first-degree murder. Many sensational facts, the register said, would no doubt be expected at the trial of the case. The grand jury never indicted him. There was no trial. It just sort of went away. But in the midst of all this, the press discovered that Scott, who at the time was 41, was to be married to the young Lulu Hammond. Decades later, one of Scott's nieces recalled that Lulu had been living above Scott's saloon in one of the apartments that Scott would later be indicted for leasing to women of ill fame for immoral purposes. At the time of the 1910 census, Lulu reported she was 23, which would have made her as young as 17 at the time of her marriage to the 41-year-old Scott. What Lulu was doing alone in Des Moines in 1904, much less with the 41-year-old Scott, is perhaps unknowable. Lulu may have been one of the many young women from rural areas who came to Des Moines to seek employment, often in response to newspaper advertisements, many of whom ended up in the brothels when the positions they sought evaporated or, more likely, turned out never to have existed. Perhaps Lulu was just a lucky teenager who found love in the arms of a 41-year-old accused murderer. Maybe she was one of the many young girls lured to Des Moines who chose marriage as an alternative to prostitution. But there's no doubt that Scott, like so many others in the Court Avenue area, was engaged in the prostitution business. Although the papers never discussed what Lulu was doing in Des Moines, his engagement to a woman less than half his age while he was under investigation for murder gave them plenty to work with. The Davenport Daily Times, again, indicated the breadth of Scott's reputation in Iowa. This isn't the Davenport newspaper. Provided the most salacious account. Under the headline, "She Marries a Murderer," the paper reported that Lulu Hannon, a winsome Des Moines girl of about 19, has consented to become the bride of E.W. Scott, who besides being 40 years of age, is accused of murder. Only 2 weeks ago, Scott shot Morris Shea in an East Des Moines saloon, claiming self-defense. And that was the end of the investigation of the murder of Laura Shea.
I can tell you that his marriage to Lulu did not end well.
No.
And so you'll read about that in the book.
Although she did outlive him, which gives us a whole another chapter when she briefly married an Indian Hindu prince,
Count
Count
Nathu.
Nathu, which that's really it, but you just have to read it.
It's too crazy
It's
to
too crazy.
describe.
It could have been its own book. It's that crazy. Starts in Wisconsin, goes to Illinois, goes to Iowa, Des Moines, then Iowa City, Missouri, Oklahoma, basically repeating the same pattern every
I think in Doug's review,
Yes.
you called him. You said he was Houdini.
There's a blend of Bernie Madoff
And-
and Harry Houdini.
Yeah.
So one of the wonderful things about this book is the side characters. That when you're doing this primary research, I mean these rabbit holes you go down. I mean you're almost helpless. You have to go because this Lulu's second husband. Was she
Yeah.
married? Did she
No.
marry the guy? No. She ended
Well, she was said
We
to
don't
be
know.
his wife.
She ended up with this guy. So tell us more. There's this guy named Count
Well,
Nathu who's like this incredibly colorful confidence man. And again, you're reading it and you're like, he's pulling these like just ridiculous schemes to pull money out of people. But
Hang on.
as soon as you start to kind of get drawn to him as a colorful figure, I mean, he's also probably a sexual predator.
Oh,
Well,
absolutely.
this is typical of the many descriptions of this guy in newspapers in Wisconsin and Iowa and Oklahoma, and Missouri and Oklahoma. Just two paragraphs. One typical story in 1900. He didn't get to go until 1908, so his reputation goes way back. One typical story in 1900 described Count Nathu as a, quote, Hindu nobleman from Lucknow, India, a man of intelligence and learning who inherited his gifts of magic from ancestors who were among the greatest magicians in India. Although he supposedly does not like to speak of the fact he is a relative of the present king of India. Descriptions of the couple, this is Nathu and his first wife, characterize them as high-caste Hindus, thoroughly educated, highly cultured people, a gentleman and a lady of refinement, whose feats were due not to any invisible power, but rather the scientific education received under the famous Hindu masters. The Count's physical appearance is described in particularly glowing terms. This is a direct quote. He is no larger than an ordinary boy of 10 or 12 years of age, his hands and feet being small and delicate. His features are regular and handsome, after the order of devils, and 2 rows of teeth as perfect as though chiseled by measure and as though bleached by some subtle alchemy to an indescribable whiteness, glistened between his full red lips like pearls in a crimson jewel case. His hair is heavy, rich, and glossy. He has a black mustache and black eyes in which flicker and dart the light of 1,000 emotions, all intense and contagious. Now, and that's not just from one story. That's an amalgamation of about 6 or 7 different stories, and the whole thing gets repeated when he gets to the point. They just adored this guy.
Yeah, and he falls out of favor with the Des Moines press rather spectacularly, and you'll have to read the book to find out.
Well, I can tell him why,
happens.
can't I? Why he fell out of press. I can give him that. He was accused of having fathered a baby with a 16-year-old patient of his while the mother was downstairs and he was upstairs treating her.
And then this guy wasn't just, Count Nathu wasn't just an obscure character. He ran something called the Temple of Psychology.
Right.
And he did seem to have some kind of a sorcery touch with the media. He seemed to be able to, like, they would write about him almost in like religious terms.
Well, the kind of stuff I read, he had that reputation in Des Moines for years until he finally tripped up, or was alleged to have tripped up. I won't tell you how the trial ended. Initially he had dozens of people coming to his Temple of Psychology to learn about Buddhism, and he quite publicly told the Register he's here because all these people in Des Moines need to follow the one true faith, Buddhism, instead of this silly Christianity. And when I read that, I thought, really, they didn't just run him out of town. They didn't. He had dozens, and then he had more dozens, and then he had hundreds of people coming to listen to him talk about Buddhism and philosophy. It's really quite amazing.
And it was had very little to do with Erastus Scott and the original story we were telling, but it was, and we talked about, we're going to put it in the book, but in the end, it was too good to leave out.
And
So-
fortunately, he married Lulu for
Yeah.
about 2 months in 1914, so we had a hook, which is how I discovered the whole thing.
So I have more questions. I'll save one or two till the end if we need it. But
We're gonna have to be,
let's go to the
Yeah,
audience.
questions.
Yeah.
Great.
So I can see you've all been super. Please.
How many women were arrested during all this stuff, and were there any male patients, not patients, customers who were arrested for soliciting prostitution?
I didn't see any reference to anybody being arrested for soliciting, and the women would be fined. They might have to go into the courthouse to pay their fine or receive the paperwork for the fine, but they wanted to circulate them and get them back. The police, the town, wanted to get them in and out and back to work so they could find them again the next month.
More questions. Please.
Yeah, I kind of have a question. Given you guys both like journalists, modern era, you guys kind of talk about like journalism, more like solicitous, sensationalist. Like, do you guys have any like reflections on today's media with that? Maybe other outlets with newspapers and all that, but like given your background, reflect on that with your exposure.
Great question, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is not the kind of journalism that I was taught in journalism school, but also the kind of journalism I was taught, I'm not sure exists much anymore either. You know, I mean, I could go on for hours about the fragmentation of, you know, media and what it's done, what it's doing to our country, and so, but I also think just as interesting is the difference not only in the newspapers and the way they were written, but we also write about several trials and the behavior in the courtroom, antics in the courtroom, also bear no relationship to what modern jurisprudence looks like. Would you say?
Oh, yeah, for sure. But I think related to that and more directly related to your question, that during a couple of these trials, there were 3 daily newspapers all covering the trials in a level of detail I don't think you get in modern newspapers at all, or really even on TV. They don't give it enough time or space. There would be articles that would take a better portion of a big piece on the front page and a better portion of an inside page. And this is back when newspapers had like 12 columns across, they were broadsheets. And it would almost be the stream of consciousness. That reporter was in there taking notes as fast as he could, and as soon as he got out, he called the office and dictated a story, and it was in the paper. And what because you have morning and afternoon papers, you have the afternoon paper covering the morning trial, and then the morning paper the next day covering what happened in the afternoon the day before. And fortunately for us, in trying to write about this, you had 3 different accounts that were sometimes quite overlapping, and so you got to see maybe a different interpretation of it, but pretty much you could see that they were telling it straight. They were recounting the names of the witnesses and the gist of the testimony, the cross-examination, the craziness of the lawyers, especially the defense counsel, and just the way the judges were just being driven crazy trying to keep the circus under control, and the public. These courtrooms were jammed as courtrooms could be with the public. This murder was so well known in Des Moines in 1905 that in 1918, when the story ended, after having years of no real coverage of the murder, they just referenced the aggressor murder in the headline, and everybody knew exactly what they were talking about. That's how well known this was.
The land grab seems so sophisticated compared to, I mean, prostitution seems like pretty cut and dried for money. Was him being a failed farmer give him special understanding of how to do these deed falsifications?
Well, the land fraud was mostly the Carter brothers and their mother. They were big real estate investors, and we try to. It's hard to really nail down how much property they own, but they own a lot of property. And one question that we struggled with and we never answered was where these people got the money for this. The mother had been abandoned. She had abandoned her husband in the 1895 time period, and he and most of the kids had gone off to California, leaving her behind with the one son who was just getting out of the penitentiary and 2 others. And all of a sudden, the 3 or 4 of them are buying up lots all over town. And
Or stealing them.
or stealing, because it seems to us when you read the two frauds, the fraud that led to the aggressor fund transferring and the murder, and then this other very complicated fraud in 1907-ish, you got to say to yourself, they can't have been caught the only 2 times they did this. They pulled this off how many times to get the kind of money it would have taken. Plus, they're also involved in theft and fencing operations at the same time. So they're using the money, I think, from various criminal enterprises, engaging in land fraud, buying more land, and stealing it.
Do you know anything about your grandfather's family or the history of their family?
Yes, he was the youngest of 8 children, and there was no criminality that we could find among his siblings. His parents were farmers as well, and I think both sides of his family had been in the U.S. for hundreds of years, like in colonial times. And honestly, we didn't find anybody else in the family, and we just yesterday or the day before, located his grave in Glendale Cemetery. He was buried in an unmarked grave. Nobody claimed, after his death, nobody claimed his body, and so we did find it, and it was quite sad.
Just to talk a little bit about his lineage, how he came from the founders of Des Moines.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing. We do know, we know that as well. So his grandparents, I guess, or great-grandparents, his family had been among the pioneers of Des Moines. And I'd heard growing up about the Pioneer Club, but I never really knew what it was, much less that I could have belonged. And so they were well known for being among the first settlers in Des Moines. And one of his relatives had owned land in East Des Moines and had donated a big portion of it to the state for construction of the Capitol building. And so it's quite a leap from those people to Erastus Scott.
When Erastus's dad had fallen ill and was near death, I think around 1909 or 1910, there was an article in the paper about this. I wish I could remember exactly how they described it, but it was in really venerable terms. It was one of the pioneers of Des Moines was fallen ill, and he's been taken to the home of his son, E.W. Scott, and they gave the address. And I thought, that's Erastus. But there's no mention, because they were so solicitous of protecting the reputation of his dad from the sins of his son, that they never mentioned in the article. And those reporters knew exactly who E.W. Scott was. Nothing about how he had just gotten out of the penitentiary so it must have been like 1909.
Yeah.
He just got out of the penitentiary and was probably about to get sent back for trying to beat his wife to death. But that's not in the article. But that's his parents were important people.
That's right. And so when he died in 1912, he had 3 daughters living nearby and a slew of siblings, and nobody came forward to claim his body.
Yeah.
That's how bad this guy was.
And just incidentally, I made an effort to find descendants. Obviously, we kind of knew the descendants of Erastus and his daughters, but I looked for the siblings and their descendants. And Des Moines was full of Scott descendants of this family until the 1950s and 1960s when the census represented. And so finding after that is very difficult. But there are no doubt, and aside from your kids and your grandchildren who are all descendants of Erastus, there are clearly there are very likely to be dozens, if not 100 or more, descendants of the Flynns, the Scotts, and the Carters.
There's
Still,
there's one right there.
You had a question, sir?
Yes.
Well, I was just going to ask you, the Hubble's being land named like they were. Is there a connection between them and the Carters?
Not that I doubt it. The Carters.
They owned a lot of land, though.
They bought individual parcels. They and their mother were as new developments were being identified. When you find the tax records, you can see the 5 or 6 or 10 people who were just snatching up properties all over the place. But the Hubbles, I don't think, were in that business. They might have been developing properties and building warehouses and houses and houses of prostitution, but they weren't. I didn't find anything to connect them.
So when you talk about that they made the ladies wear this clothes and they didn't give them other than Erastus and the Carters, who was the they? I mean, who was also in charge of keeping prostitution
Yeah,
going?
I don't honestly know the answer. We were just focused on what's the connection to Erastus and all this stuff, but there were no doubt hundreds
There had to be.
people who were bringing these girls in. I mean, the Dickerhoffs are the ones Rose was talking about earlier, who were in prison for this, who were bringing these girls in, setting them up, locking them down, and making sure they couldn't get away.
So if this girl's got pregnant, did they go to some
Yeah,
weird doctor or
We didn't get into that, but but when we were doing our research, we found a master's thesis, I think, by a woman who I think was a graduate student at Iowa State, I think.
We don't cite her in the book.
Yeah, we don't cite her. But she was doing a sociological paper about the history of prostitution in the heartland, in Des Moines.
If you Google that, will come up.
And so and then she wrote, and she does mention, she turned that into a little book, and she does mention Erastus in her book. But and then she wrote a little book too about the history of the East Village.
I think that's where Erastus is.
Yeah, I think that's where his name is.
But she missed the big story.
Yeah, we looked at her stuff to see if we overlapped at all, but and we didn't really go into much of her research because it wasn't what we were terribly interested in. But I would guess that may answer some of those questions.
So Jan wants people to have time to get books signed and talk individually.
We've already signed all the books because you folks have already bought every copy of it.
But if there's anybody else who has a book,
And we will take special orders.
Yes.
And Jen, you expect to get more books any minute now.
Hopefully tomorrow. Maybe.
It's
Oh, no,
not
it's
approved
Saturday.
yet,
No, it'll
and
be
I
next
don't know from the publisher. They have the right to do it, but they haven't done it or told us if they intend to.
So do you want more questions here, or do you want people to talk individually with them? Your story, your call.
We can take a couple more questions. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So is a lady named Nell? Is that who you're talking about just now? The book.
I do cite her book about East Des Moines in the footnotes. I can't remember her name.
I just kind of saw it in here, and that wasn't really my question, but I wanted to ask is.
We tried to find her, and we've emailed her, and she has not responded to us. That woman.
She wrote like about prostitution.
Yeah,
in Red
that's
Light
probably
District.
her.
I think
Yeah,
it was.
yeah.
Is that your main primary sources? Would you mostly just stick to the 3 newspapers, or did you?
I think the information about prostitution comes almost 100%, I would say, just off the top of my head, from the newspapers. We didn't have any other sources other than newspapers, and I certainly didn't want to cite or rely on a secondary source like a book somebody else had written, because, I'm not going to criticize the book, but it didn't cover the level of detail that we wanted to cover. So it's all from that stuff comes from the newspapers. We did have other sources, prison records, hospital records. We got the Clorinda State Hospital mental progress notes from when her great-grandmother was committed and her death. We got those. The city of Des Moines was fabulously helpful in identifying the location of properties. We tried to find Gresser's farm, and we found the land his farm was on, and we hoped the house was still going to be there.
Or some of the house.
But and the city gave us aerial maps of all the properties, and they showed which had been subdivided and which were part of the original parcel. And there's some houses on there now. And we went out there and we talked to some of the current owners and asked them questions that they knew about the house, and they really know. And I think we're pretty convinced that it's gone. We know it was abandoned for several years because about 2 years after Gresser's death, the neighbors reported hearing Gresser's ghost wandering around and making a lot of noise, and someone remembered that Gresser had said before his death that if he ever got murdered, I would haunt that house and make sure whoever got my house would be haunted. And so some of the farmers went and slept in the house overnight, supposedly, to see if Gresser's ghost would show up.
What area would you do?
It's in Avon Township. We actually intentionally did not provide the location because I thought You know, if this book really got a lot of traction, I wouldn't want to have people going out there to these folks and doing what we did.
In the back, you have a question.
Yeah, you gathered information from so many articles in the Register, and from what I'm understanding of your discussion, the outrage really didn't come until the temperance movement came. Those women came to town. What was the sense in the community that this was just an isolated area? I mean, Des Moines was being formed not too far from there. So was this just shut
Well,
from the rest of the community?
by late 1905, Erastus gets indicted. He's one of the first people indicted for running houses of prostitution. And there was a big front page story about he and a couple of the guys that had gotten indicted for running houses of prostitution. And the papers anticipated that this would mean that, okay, now the city's really going to make this push. But the city came back and said, we need the revenue from the mulct. They call it the mulct, M-U-L-C-T, which was just a word for the fine or the tax. Some called it a tax on prostitution, which generated the complaint in 1908 that we're doing less than nothing. We're just imposing a fee. We're not trying to stop it. And so you could see for a couple of years, there were fits and starts of efforts to limit prostitution, and that eventually they decided they were going to consolidate it all. They needed to bring it all together, take it, because it was all over town, and they were going to put it on East Gord Avenue, which they did around 1906. And there it was until 1908, when finally, between the disease and the women's groups, and just the social awfulness of the whole thing, the city fathers just couldn't take the pressure anymore, and they appointed this guy Hammer to shut it down.
Now that you know your wife's potential genetic propensity for beating somebody up at the drop of a hat, are you nicer to her?
I sleep with one eye open.
I don't blame you.
That's a great question to end it on. Thank you everybody for being here.
Thank you all so much for coming. This is so
Just,
much fun for us.
if you want a special order, Meg can take your name and.
And let me just echo that. You've all come here and we sat in their space and enjoyed their hosting us. Please don't go buy your copy on Amazon. Buy it here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.